Before he became a legend, Abraham Lincoln walked through a world of poverty, loss, and impossible struggles, yet every step of his dark journey forged the leader who would change the fate of a nation. The story of Abraham Lincoln's dark journey toward greatness begins long before the world ever knew his name. In a rugged stretch of America where poverty was not just a condition but a constant companion, shaping every breath, every choice, and every dream that dared to rise above the soil. Born in a one-room log cabin on the edge of the Kentucky frontier, he entered a world marked by unforgiving winters, backbreaking labor, and the ever-present uncertainty of survival. His childhood unfolded in the shadow of hardship. The wooden walls that sheltered him rattled with wind, and the thin blankets that covered him could not always keep out the cold. Yet these early years forged in him a quiet resilience not easily seen from the outside. He grew up watching his father struggle to keep the family afloat, moving from one patch of land to another, always trying to outrun debt, disputes, or the bitter reality of failed harvests. Lincoln's mother, Nancy, whose gentle strength left an imprint on him far deeper than her short life allowed, instilled in him the value of kindness and the power of learning. Her death, when he was only 9, carved a wound so deep that even decades later, he spoke of it with a trembling reverence. Losing her to milk sickness, a slow, agonizing illness that swept through frontier households, marked the first of many times Lincoln would learn that life could take from him without warning. The crude pine coffin, the silent woods, and the hollow echo of earth covering her grave became a memory he carried well into adulthood, shaping his sensitivity to human suffering. But it was not only personal grief that traced the outline of his early life. The world around him was steeped in contradictions. Freedom proclaimed loudly on the frontier, while slavery stretched across much of the nation. As a boy, Lincoln saw enslaved men and women chained together on the road, march south to markets, their faces blank or resigned, their futures stolen. These scenes disturbed him deeply, though he rarely spoke of them, storing the images in the quiet corners of his mind. Over time, those silent observations grew into the moral compass that would later guide him through the darkest political storms in American history. Still, as a child, he had no way of knowing the weight those memories would eventually carry. His days were consumed by labor splitting rails, chopping logs, helping with farm work tasks that shaped his tall, weary frame and tested his endurance. Schooling came in scattered fragments, no more than a few months at a time, in drafty cabins where lessons were short and survival was the true curriculum. Yet Lincoln devoured every book he could find. Neighbors recalled seeing him walk miles barefoot just to borrow a single volume, reading by firelight late into the night until the flames died and darkness forced him to pause. His relationship with his father grew strained as the years went on. Thomas Lincoln valued physical work over intellectual pursuits, and Abraham's hunger for learning often clashed with his father's expectations. The frontier demanded practicality, not poetry, yet young Lincoln found refuge in word scriptures, fables, biographies, each one expanding his world beyond the fences of the farm. This growing divide between father and son created emotional distances more profound than the physical ones they later endured. When the family moved again, this time to Indiana and later Illinois, the restless pattern continued, uprooting connections and forcing Lincoln to confront the impermanence of everything around him. Each relocation brought new challenges, new losses, and new lessons in endurance. When he reached adulthood, Lincoln began to carve a path of his own, leaving home to work as a store clerk, a laborer, a surveyor, whatever job kept him afloat. In New Salem, Illinois, he found a place where his curious mind and quiet humor made him stand out. People gravitated toward him not because of flashiness or charm, but because something about him felt trustworthy, grounded, and unmistakably sincere. He read the law on borrowed books and evenings illuminated by candle stubs, determined to rise beyond the circumstances of his birth. Yet despite the outward progress, shadows lingered beneath the surface. Lincoln battled bouts of deep melancholy, a darkness he once described as so overwhelming that he feared the pull of despair would consume him entirely. Friends watched him fall into long silences, staring out windows with a look that suggested he carried burdens too heavy to name. At times, Lincoln himself questioned whether he was strong enough to push through the weight pressing on his spirit. But he continued to move forward, one deliberate step at a time, even when hope seemed thinned out. As he entered public life, running first for the Illinois state legislature, Lincoln found himself navigating a political world as turbulent as the childhood he had left behind. His early speeches were simple, but carried a sincerity that resonated with ordinary people. He supported internal improvements and infrastructure projects that he believed would uplift struggling communities like the one he grew up in. But financial hardships followed him relentlessly. A failed business venture left him buried in debt so deep, in fact, that it took him years to repay it. Some men would have walked away or declared bankruptcy, but Lincoln paid every dollar back, earning the nickname Honest Abe. His political career advanced slowly, punctuated by moments of doubt and reflection. He studied law more seriously, becoming a respected attorney known for his fairness, sharp reasoning, and ability to connect with juries. His speeches became more polished, his ideas more defined, and his convictions stronger. Yet even as he rose in stature, his personal life remained marked by sorrow. His romance with Anne Rutledge ended in tragedy when she died of illness, a loss that devastated him and led to one of the deepest depressive episodes of his life. The people of New Salem watched helplessly as Lincoln wandered the woods, unable to escape the weight of grief. His friends even feared for his safety, taking turns staying with him so he would not be left alone. Though the pain eventually softened, it never disappeared fully. Lincoln carried Anne's memory as a quiet, unspoken ache, one that resurfaced in moments of solitude. His marriage to Mary Todd brought companionship, but also turmoil. Mary was intelligent, ambitious, and deeply supportive of Lincoln's aspiration. Yet their life together was often strained by financial stress, political uncertainty, and Mary's own struggles with emotional instability. Still, they built a family, and Lincoln found profound joy in fatherhood. His children brought light into the darker corners of his life, their laughter echoing through their home, their energy lifting his spirit. But the shadow of tragedy was never far away. The death of his young son Edward left the family shattered, adding another layer of grief that Lincoln bore quietly. As national tensions over slavery escalated, Lincoln found himself drawn irresistibly into the moral and political conflict that would define his legacy. His debates with Stephen A. Douglas elevated him onto the national stage, showcasing his eloquence and moral clarity even in defeat. Lincoln's arguments were grounded not in anger or extremism, but in a belief that the nation could not endure half slave and half free. His logic was sharp, his delivery steady, but beneath his calm exterior lay the same complex mix of emotion, memory, and conviction that had shaped him since childhood. He stepped into the national spotlight with the weight of history already pressing upon him, though he could not yet see the storm that awaited. By the time he was nominated for president in 1860, Lincoln was no longer the barefoot boy reading by firelight, but neither had he forgotten those formative years. His life had become a mosaic of struggle and perseverance, each piece contributing to a quiet strength that set him apart. Yet even as cheers rose around him, he sensed that triumph did not come without cost. The air was thick with division, threats of secession, and the growing certainty that the nation was headed toward conflict. Lincoln's journey from the dimly lit cabin of his youth to the threshold of the White House had been marked by loss, resilience, and relentless determination. And though he had stepped into the light of leadership, darker days loomed ahead, ready to test everything he had become and everything he believed. The moment Abraham Lincoln stepped into the national crisis that would engulf his presidency, he understood with chilling clarity that the years ahead would demand every ounce of endurance he possessed. The election of 1860, which placed him in the White House, did not arrive with celebration or unity, but with immediate defiance. Even before he took office, Southern states began seceding from the Union, their leaders unwilling to accept a president who opposed the expansion of slavery. Lincoln watched the map of the country fracture piece by piece, each act of secession like a silent door closing in a long hallway. He had dreamed of guiding the nation toward a future where liberty stood on firmer ground, but instead, he faced a storm unlike any leader before him. Washington was thick with tension, the streets filled with rumors of assassination attempts, conspiracies, and plots. When Lincoln's train traveled to the Capitol for his inauguration, authorities insisted on altering his route and disguising his movements, fearful that extremists would attempt to kill him before he could even take the oath. Some newspapers mocked these precautions, painting him as timid, but Lincoln understood the real stakes. His life was not simply his own anymore. It was tied to the fragile future of a divided nation. In the earliest days of his presidency, Lincoln confronted a Congress fractured by fury and mistrust, military leaders who doubted him, and a public uncertain whether he could hold the country together. He was inexperienced in matters of war, Yet he found himself responsible for decisions that would shape the lives of millions. His cabinet, chosen for its political balance, was filled with men who were rivals rather than allies, each convinced of his own superior judgment. Instead of resisting their hostility, Lincoln listened, learned, and gradually earned their respect. He spent long nights poring over military manuals, studying maps, and seeking counsel from generals. Though many dismissed him at first, the pressures around him intensified as the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter ignited the Civil War. The nation watched in horror as neighbors turned into enemies, families were torn apart, and the streets filled with young soldiers marching toward battlefields, whose names would soon be etched in history for their devastation. Throughout these early months, Lincoln carried a profound sense of isolation. The White House, though grand in appearance, was filled with echoes of doubt and sleepless nights. Mary Todd Lincoln struggled under the weight of public scrutiny and personal loss, and their marriage faced strains born from fear, mourning, and political chaos. Their son Willie, whose radiant personality had been a source of joy, became seriously ill. The noise of war could not drown out the sound of a child's labored breathing. Lincoln, already burdened by military setbacks and public criticism, found himself helpless at the bedside of his beloved son. When Willie died in 1862, the loss nearly broke him. He wandered the halls in grief so heavy that even his closest advisors worried for his ability to continue. Newspapers criticized him relentlessly, generals ignored his orders, and now death had stolen yet another life from his life. But even in despair, he understood that the fate of the nation rested on his shoulders. He steadied himself with the knowledge that personal sorrow could not outweigh the suffering of thousands of families, losing sons to battle dot as the war intensified. Lincoln found himself facing some of the darkest decisions ever placed before an American president. Casualty lists grew longer with every passing month. The letters of widows and grieving parents poured into the White House, and public anger erupted over military setbacks. Some demanded he make peace and allow the South to remain separate. Others insisted he push harder for victory. In the midst of this turmoil, Lincoln wrestled with the deeply moral question of slavery. He had always believed the institution was morally wrong, but he moved cautiously, aware that the border states still loyal to the Union were deeply tied to slavery. He feared that a premature proclamation might drive them into Confederate arms. Yet as he read reports of enslaved people fleeing to Union lines, of families torn apart, of human beings treated as property, his conviction hardened. The war was not merely a political conflict. It had become a moral reckoning. In the quiet hours of the night, Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, knowing that signing it would transform the war's purpose and redefine the nation's future. The decision, however, did not bring immediate clarity or relief. As news of emancipation spread, Lincoln faced intense backlash. Critics accused him of overreach, radicals said he had not gone far enough, and Confederate leaders used the proclamation to inflame resistance. Yet Lincoln stood firm, believing that the war could not be won without confronting its root cause. He saw in the eyes of the freed men who reached northern lines a reflection of his own early struggles, the yearning for a life shaped by possibility rather than circumstance. Their faith in him strengthened his resolve. Still, victory remained distant. Union armies suffered humiliating defeats, generals were replaced again and again, and Lincoln carried the weight of every battlefield failure as though it were a personal wound. He visited hospitals filled with wounded soldiers, shaking hands with young men whose futures had been stolen by bullets and disease. They looked at him with trust, hope, or quiet resignation. Each face reinforced the urgency of his mission. The emotional toll of the war deepened Lincoln's already quiet and reflective nature. The melancholy that had shadowed him since youth grew heavier, threatening at times to swallow him whole. Yet somehow, he channeled this darkness into empathy rather than despair. His speech is simple, direct, and profoundly human, cut through the noise of politics and touched people across the divided nation. The Gettysburg Address, delivered on a cold November day amid rows of fresh graves, was not grand in length or flourish, yet it captured the essence of the nation's struggle, a fight not only for unity, but for a renewed commitment to equality and human dignity. The crowd listened in silence, some puzzled by its brevity, others moved without fully understanding why. With just a few lines, Lincoln reframed the war as a test of the nation's soul. Despite the rhetorical victories, the war still dragged on. Cities burned, farms lay in ruins, and both North and South suffered under the weight of exhaustion. Lincoln faced the political battle of re-election in 1864, a contest he believed he might lose, given the nation's frustration. But the tide of war began to turn. As General Ulysses S. Grant pushed deeper into Confederate territory, soldiers began returning home with news of hope rather than defeat. When Lincoln won re-election, it signaled a renewed faith in his leadership. Though he accepted the victory with humility rather than triumph, still, danger surrounded him. His decisions had earned him powerful enemies. Threatening letters flowed into the White House, and whispers of assassination circulated through the Capitol. Lincoln understood that the cost of leadership could include his own life, yet he continued his work without retreating into fear. By early 1865, the Confederacy weakened on all fronts, and Lincoln prepared to rebuild a nation shattered by hatred, bloodshed, and betrayal. He dreamed of healing wounds, restoring families, and extending compassion even to former enemies. He spoke of reconciliation with a gentleness that startled some of his own supporters, believing that cruelty could not form the foundation of a lasting peace. But even as the war neared its end, Lincoln could feel a strange heaviness settling over him. He expressed to those close to him that he felt a sense of foreboding, as though he would not live to see the country rebuilt. His dreams grew more vivid, his reflections deeper, and the lines on his face revealed exhaustion carved by 4 years of unrelenting pressure. Yet through it all, he continued to guide the nation toward its final steps of victory, aware that every decision might be the last one he would make. As the brutal winter of 1865 gave way to the first fragile hints of spring, the atmosphere in Washington seemed to shift ever so slightly, as though the nation itself were exhaling after years of holding its breath. Victory was near, but the scars of conflict ran deep. Lincoln, carrying the weight of her harrowing years of war, moved through the Capitol with a tired grace that reflected both the suffering he had witnessed and the hope he believed still lay ahead. He spent his days immersed in paperwork, meetings, and the endless decisions that came with the approaching end of the Confederacy. Yet it was in his evening's quiet moments stolen between crisis and responsibility that his mind drifted to what the future might demand. Reconstruction loomed like a vast and uncertain frontier, one no less treacherous than the physical wilderness of his youth. The Union might survive the war, but its soul would require careful tending. Lincoln knew that the wounds, emotional, political, racial, would not heal easily, and he feared that the bitterness forged on battlefields would seep into the next generation. Still, he believed deeply in the possibility of a reconciled nation. He imagined a United States where former enemies could one day share common dreams again, where freed men would walk with dignity, where political divisions might slowly soften beneath the weight of shared humanity. Even as Lincoln envisioned this path forward, he remained acutely aware of the dangers surrounding him. The war had made him a symbol of beacon for some and a target for others. Angry whispers haunted the Capitol, conspiracies, plots, and the feverish desperation of those who refused to accept the Confederacy's impending collapse. Lincoln read letters filled with threats, some crude, others chillingly precise. Yet he rarely allowed fear to guide him. Courage, to him, was not the absence of danger, but the steadfastness to act despite it. His security detailed such as it was worried constantly about his habit of walking alone at night, slipping out of the White House to think, to breathe, to escape the relentless presence of war. But Lincoln persisted in these solitary wanderings, believing that a man who allowed fear to cage him had already surrendered the essence of leadership. These nighttime walks gave him space to process the immense grief he carried, including the loss of his sons, the weight of thousands of dead soldiers, and the strain etched across Mary's face as she battled her own anguish. He understood sorrow intimately, and it shaped the gentle resolve with which he approached the nation's reconstruction. Though he bore immense burdens, Lincoln also found solace in moments of human connection. He visited hospitals frequently, walking between rows of wounded soldiers, offering quiet words or simply sitting beside them in silence. They looked up at him with a mixture of awe and affection, seeing in his weary eyes the same pain that marked their own. He often lingered long after officials urged him to move on, unwilling to treat these human lives as mere symbols of war. Rather, he saw in each young man a reminder of the cost of the Union's survival, sons who would never return home, families who would forever feel the absence carved by conflict. These visits strengthened his conviction that the nation owed not only gratitude, but justice to those who had sacrificed everything. As he read reports of formerly enslaved men joining the Union Army, fighting for a freedom long withheld, Lincoln felt a renewed determination to ensure that emancipation would not be a temporary wartime measure but a cornerstone of America's future. The collapse of the Confederacy came not with celebration, but with an overwhelming mixture of relief, exhaustion, and sorrow. When Richmond finally fell, Lincoln traveled to the defeated capital, a moment many saw as symbolic, almost biblical in its imagery. He walked through the streets without grand ceremony, without a protective entourage capable of matching the broken city around him. Formerly enslaved people flocked to him, some dropping to their knees in gratitude. Lincoln, visibly moved, urged them to rise, insisting that freedom belonged to them by right, not by gift. The ruins of Richmond stretched around him, burned buildings, smoldering streets, families picking through debris. But within that devastation, Lincoln saw something resembling hope. He entered the Confederate White House quietly, pausing in Jefferson Davis's office to reflect on the weight of choices made there. The symbolism was powerful. The nation's future would be rebuilt not on dominance or revenge, but on a steady moral foundation carved from suffering and perseverance. In the days that followed, Lincoln set about crafting the outlines of reconstruction. His approach was marked by mercy rather than vengeance, an attitude that baffled some and infuriated others. Critics demanded punishment for Confederate leaders, heavy reparations, and harsh laws. But Lincoln believed that cruelty could only sow more bitterness. He wanted the South to return to the Union not as a defeated enemy, but as a reconciled partner. He envisioned schools, rebuilt communities, and political inclusion for formerly enslaved people. These ideas faced resistance at every turn, not only from Southerners unwilling to accept change, but also from Northerners determined to impose strict retribution. Lincoln found himself navigating another battlefield, one fought with ideologies instead of rifles. But he had learned long ago that true leadership required patience, empathy, and the courage to pursue what was morally right despite the noise of anger. During this period, Lincoln's health visibly declined. Photographs taken near the end of the war show a man aged beyond his 56 years, deep lines etched across his face, eyes shadowed with fatigue, shoulders sagging from years of unrelenting strain. He confided in close friends that he felt oddly detached from life, haunted by dreams that seemed to foreshadow something final. One dream in particular, which he shared days before his death, involved wandering through the White House in search of the source of quiet sobbing, only to find a covered corpse guarded by soldiers. When he asked who had died, a soldier replied, "The President." Lincoln woke uneasy, though he spoke of the dream without fear. He had always sensed that the war might claim his life as surely as it had claimed so many others, and that sense of destiny lent him a strange peace. He sought time with his sons, cherished brief moments of calm with Mary, and allowed himself perhaps for the first time in years to imagine life after war. He spoke of traveling, of seeing California, of returning to the simplicity of his earlier days. But even these hopes carried a fragile quality, as though he already knew they were not his to experience. The final days of Lincoln's life were filled with a mixture of triumph and unease. Richmond had fallen, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, and celebrations erupted across the North. Crowds gathered outside the White House cheering his name, waving flags, and singing patriotic hymns. Lincoln stepped to the window to address them, offering words not of victory, but of healing, urging unity and compassion. He emphasized the importance of extending voting rights to educated black men and those who had served in the Union Army, a radical idea for the time. His voice carried conviction, but also fatigue. He knew that the battles ahead, the battles of justice, equality, and rebuilding would in some ways be more complex than those fought with cannon and musket. Meanwhile, a different kind of darkness was growing elsewhere in the capital. John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor with deep Confederate sympathies, seethed with anger at the news of the Confederacy's defeat. To him, Lincoln represented not just an opposing political leader, but a destroyer of the Southern way of life. Booth had long fantasized about removing Lincoln from power, believing that a dramatic act could revive the Confederate cause or at least avenge its downfall. As the war ended, his ideas grew more desperate, more violent. He gathered co-conspirators, sketched out plans, and watched Lincoln's movements with obsessive attention. The president's habit of moving without strong security made Booth's intentions feel not only possible, but inevitable. In the shadows of Washington's theaters, streets, and taverns, whispers of conspiracy thickened. Lincoln, unaware of the specific threat closing in around him, allowed himself a rare moment of lightness. On the evening of April 14th, Good Friday, he accepted an invitation to attend a play at Ford's Theater. He hoped the outing would lift Mary's spirits, which had been strained by loss and worry. As they prepared to leave, Lincoln spoke softly of the future, of the peace he hoped to nurture, of the long years of national healing ahead. The warm air of early spring drifted through the city as the carriage carried them to the theater, where an audience awaited the president with joy and admiration. Lincoln's entrance was met with applause, a brief respite from the years of conflict and criticism. He smiled, settling into his seat, unaware that the darkest chapter of his journey was moments away. The warm hum of the audience inside Ford's theater wrapped the night in a strange mixture of celebration and fragility, the kind of atmosphere that feels suspended between joy and fate. The crowd laughed easily at the play's lively moments, and Mary, beside Lincoln, appeared lighter than she had in months, her eyes no longer marked by the heaviness of grief. Lincoln himself sat with an air of deep but quiet contentment, as though he were finally beginning to believe the war's long shadow might truly recede. Yet even in this moment of calm, he carried within him a weariness that could not be shed. The burdens of leadership, the horrors he had witnessed, and the mournful journey the nation had traveled with him were etched into the lines of his face. He had spoken earlier that day about this very heaviness, suggesting to close friends that the fight of the past years had aged him beyond his time. Still, he held on to hope, believing that the end of war offered a rare chance for renewal. He imagined a world where the nation could heal its wounds, where bitterness might dissolve under the weight of shared humanity, where his legacy would not be the war itself, but the peace he longed to cultivate. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to feel that this dream might be possible. John Wilkes Booth, meanwhile, moved through the backstage corridors of Ford's theater with a chilling clarity of purpose. The actor knew the building intimately, the narrow staircases, the dim passages, the hidden vantage points that only performers understood. He carried the conviction that his actions would be seen not as murder, but as political retribution, even salvation for a lost Southern cause. Fueled by anger, grief over the Confederacy's defeat, and a twisted sense of destiny, Booth believed the moment had arrived to strike. Earlier that day, he had learned that Lincoln would attend the play, and he seized upon the opportunity with fanatic urgency. He prepared his pistol and dagger with practiced precision, rehearsing silently the movements he would need to cross the threshold of the presidential box. As the play continued on stage, Booth slipped into position, emboldened by the knowledge that Lincoln's security was astonishingly lax, one lone guard absent from his post, distracted in a nearby tavern. The irony was sharp. The man who had guided the nation through its bloodiest conflict now sat vulnerable in the glow of an evening meant to soothe the soul. The atmosphere inside the theater remained lively, but time seemed to move toward a narrowing point. As though history were converging on a single silent heartbeat, Lincoln leaned back, taking in the stage with a gentle softness, unaware of the footsteps approaching behind him. The laughter of the crowd masked the faint creak of the door opening to the presidential box. Booth stepped inside, his breathing steady, his vision locked onto the back of Lincoln's head. In one swift motion, he raised the pistol and fired. The sound, sharp, metallic, devastating, cut through the air, freezing the audience mid-laugh. Mary screamed, her voice raw with terror, as Lincoln slumped forward, consciousness stolen instantly by the bullet's impact. Before anyone could react, Booth leaped from the balcony to the stage below, breaking his leg as he landed, yet still managing to shout words twisted by rage and delusion. The theater erupted into chaos, screams, confusion, bodies pushing in every direction. Doctors rushed forward, and soldiers surged toward the president's box. But the scene had already transformed from a moment of national relief into a tragedy unfolding in real time. Lincoln, gravely wounded and unresponsive, was carried across the street to a quiet boarding house, the Peterson House, where the dimly lit room smelled of oil lamps and the faint trace of spring air drifting through partially opened shutters. The bed was too small for his tall frame, so attendants laid him diagonally, careful not to disturb the wound. Mary remained inconsolable, pacing, crying, collapsing in waves of grief as doctors examined her husband, their faces drawn with grim understanding. Cabinet members and officials arrived one by one, their expressions reflecting disbelief and dread. The weight of the moment settled heavily over them all, as though the room itself had shrunk under the pressure of history being rewritten. Outside, crowds gathered despite the late hour, standing in stunned silence along the street, waiting for news with a collective breath held tight. Inside, the doctors could offer little hope. The bullet had traveled too deeply, the damage catastrophic. Lincoln's breathing grew shallow, his pulse faint, yet his face held a serenity that seemed almost otherworldly throughout the long hours of the night. Those who loved and respected Lincoln stood vigil beside him, The darkness outside pressed against the windows, broken only by the glow of lanterns reflecting off the faces of anxious citizens lining the streets. Inside, the soft murmur of whispered prayers and quiet sobs blended with the sound of Lincoln's labored breathing. Men who had served with him through the war, leaders, advisors, colleagues, watched helplessly, their emotions shifting between grief, anger, and the hollow ache of impending loss. Some reflected on the monumental weight Lincoln had carried, the choices he had made, and the grace with which he had navigated a nation divided. Others, silently battling tears, remembered the small moments of kindness that had defined him as much as any political triumph. It was a night suspended between life and death, between hope's fading glow and the cold certainty drawing near. The nation, though vast and fractured, seemed to narrow inward toward that small room, as if the heartbeat of the Union itself had moved there to keep vigil as dawn approached. A pale light seeped into the room, casting gentle shadows across the wooden floorboards. The early morning air was cool, still scented with spring blossoms carried by a faint breeze. The doctors gathered close, observing the subtle but unmistakable signs that Lincoln's life was nearing its final moments. Mary, too overwhelmed to remain continuously at his bedside, returned only briefly, her grief too great to bear witness. His son Robert, standing nearby, watched with a quiet strength, his youthful face marked by sorrow far beyond his years. Those present later recalled the profound stillness of the moment, when Lincoln drew his last breath, a silence so complete it felt as though even the world outside had paused in mourning. To the men in the room, the loss felt both deeply personal and overwhelmingly national. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, voice heavy with emotion yet steady with reverence, offered words that would echo through history that Lincoln now belonged to the ages. News of Lincoln's death spread rapidly through Washington, moving from house to house, street to street, until the entire city seemed enveloped in a grief that transcended political divides. Soldiers wept openly, citizens gathered in mournful groups, and church bells began to toll with slow, aching rhythms. Black Americans freed and newly empowered mourned with a depth born from personal understanding, recognizing that the man who had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, imperfect though his journey had been, had opened a path toward dignity and hope. In the South, reactions were more complicated. Some expressed sorrow, others relief, and many simply struggled to comprehend what Lincoln's loss meant for a nation still reeling from war. The path forward, already uncertain, now seemed shrouded in heavier darkness. Reconstruction, which Lincoln had envisioned as gentle and conciliatory, risked becoming harsher in the hands of those less inclined toward forgiveness. His absence left a void so profound that even those who had opposed him began to sense the magnitude of what had been taken. In the days that followed, Lincoln's body was prepared for the long journey home. His funeral train, draped in mourning black, traveled through cities and towns where thousands gathered to honor him. People lined the tracks for miles, some kneeling, some saluting, others simply standing in silent solidarity. Homes, churches, and public buildings displayed black ribbons, flags lowered in sorrowful tribute. The nation, wounded and weary, united briefly in shared grief. For many, Lincoln's death symbolized not just the end of a presidency, but the loss of a guiding light in a moment when guidance was desperately needed. His story, once marked by poverty, failure, resilience, and triumph, now ended with martyrdom, a transformation he never sought, but that history would inevitably give him. Yet beyond the legacy, the monuments, and the pages of textbooks that would follow, there remained the quiet truth of his humanity, a man shaped by hardship, driven by empathy, and carried through darkness by unwavering belief in something greater than himself. The morning that swept across the country revealed a deep longing for unity, a longing Lincoln had nurtured even in the darkest days of war. His assassination, though meant to silence him, instead magnified his message, forcing the nation to confront the fragility of its values. As communities grieved, conversations emerged about equality, justice, and the future of a country forever changed by conflict and by the man who had steered it through its most turbulent era. His death did not end the struggle, but it crystallized the moral stakes and the choices ahead. The reconstruction of the nation would now unfold without the steady hand of the leader who had envisioned a gentler path, leaving Americans to wrestle with the challenge of building the peace he had dreamed of. The final years of Abraham Lincoln's life unfolded like a long, trembling chord of history, part triumph, part sorrow, part impossible weight, and every decision he made echoed beyond the walls of the White House into the wounded soul of a nation. As the Union armies pressed deeper into Confederate territory and the battlefield maps began tilting in favor of the North, Lincoln moved through the presidential mansion not as a man celebrating impending victory, but as someone carrying the funeral bells of every fallen soldier inside his chest. His face had grown older, deeply lined, almost prematurely aged. Yet those who studied him closely saw that the transformation had nothing to do with time. It came instead from the relentless tension between hope and grief, unity and bloodshed, the dream of a free nation and the nightmare of a war tearing that dream apart. He had become slowly, painfully a leader shaped entirely by the suffering of a people, and by the belief that the moral core of a democracy must be protected, even when it trembles at the edge of collapse. As reports arrived of the Union's victories in 1864 and early 1865, Lincoln felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years: cautious optimism. He knew the Confederacy was weakening, and the political atmosphere around him began to shift. The country was exhausted, so drained that even the most hardened voices of dissent were softening under the promise of peace. Yet Lincoln sensed a different kind of storm gathering, not from distant battlefields, but from Washington itself. His re-election in 1864 had secured him another term, but it had also stirred the anger of those who believed that ending slavery was a step too far, or that allowing black men the promise of citizenship threatened the old hierarchies that had defined America for generations. The radical Republicans pushed him to move faster, to punish the South more harshly. Conservatives insisted he had already gone too far. Lincoln found himself in the lonely middle, attempting to bind divisions of America together, without letting either destroy the fragile future ahead. In these months, Lincoln devoted much of his energy to planning a post-war reconstruction, founded on reconciliation rather than revenge. He insisted that malice toward none meant more than a slogan. It was a blueprint for survival. He believed that a country stitched together with bitterness would eventually tear itself apart again. So he tried to the extent his weary heart could to imagine a South brought back into the Union, with dignity intact, even as it surrendered its foundations of bondage. He believed that a country stitched together with bitterness would eventually tear itself apart again. So he tried to the extent his weary heart could to imagine a South brought back into the Union, with dignity intact, even as it surrendered its foundations of bondage, and understood something deeper: no peace built on humiliation could last. He urged compassion not because he was naive, but because he feared the cost of vengeance. He wanted a nation strong enough to forgive without forgetting, determined enough to rebuild without repeating the cruelties that had led it to war. While politicians argued and generals strategized, Lincoln often walked alone at night through the dimly lit corridors of the White House, listening to the wind scrape against the windows and imagining the thousands of families waiting for news from the battlefields. He carried those people with him: every widow, every orphan, every mother praying for a son's safe return. Sometimes he stopped in front of the big window overlooking the Potomac River, staring out at the dark water as if searching for answers in its shifting surface. He thought about the freedom he had signed into law with the Emancipation Proclamation, the sacrifices made to defend it, and the generations who would inherit the consequences of his choices. He wondered whether history would understand why he fought so hard to hold the Union together, or whether it would someday forget the human cost behind every victory. But then he would straighten himself, breathe deeply, and return to work, because he knew the end of the war was near and that his duty was not yet finished. By early April 1865, when Richmond fell to Union forces, Lincoln experienced something extraordinary. He walked through the former Confederate capital as a victorious president, not in a display of power, but as a quiet witness to the end of rebellion. Crowds of newly freed slaves followed him, some falling to their knees, some calling out blessings, some weeping openly as they saw the man whose signature had meant the end of their chains. Lincoln, moved to silence, asked them gently to stand. He believed no one should kneel before him. He had not freed them alone, and he never saw himself as a savior. What mattered to him most at that moment was not triumph, but the confirmation that the cause he had tied his life to, human equality, had become real on the very soil where it had once been most brutally denied. This moment, more than any speech or proclamation, affirmed the moral dimension of the war and gave Lincoln the quiet certainty that all the pain he had endured had not been in vain. When he returned to Washington, the Capitol hummed with celebration. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and for the first time in years the streets felt alive with hope. Soldiers flooded home, newspapers declared victory, and families who had lived under the shadow of fear, finally dared to smile again. Lincoln joined these celebrations with a reserved joy, but inside he felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease. He knew that ending the war was only the beginning of a longer, more difficult challenge, rebuilding the country and ensuring that the freedom proclaimed on paper would become freedom lived in reality. He began drafting policies to reintegrate the southern states, reconstruct their governments, and protect the civil rights of freed slaves. Reconstruction was to be the next battle, one he hoped to lead with wisdom gained from hardship. Yet even amid these plans, darker currents moved beneath the surface of Washington's triumph. Lincoln had enemies, men who blamed him for the Confederacy's collapse, who saw him as a tyrant, who despised his push for equality, or who believed that his vision threatened the future they wanted for America. Among these voices of resentment was John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor whose Confederate sympathies had hardened into fanaticism. Booth convinced himself that killing Lincoln would avenge the South and prevent further progress on emancipation. He stopped the president's movements, fueled by delusion and hatred, imagining that he alone could reshape the course of history by silencing the man who had become a symbol of unity and freedom. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln allowed himself a rare moment of rest. The war had ended, Congress was hopeful, and for the first time in months, he felt the faint glow of peace settling over the nation. He accepted an invitation to attend a play at Ford's Theater, a small gesture of normalcy after years of living inside a storm. As Lincoln took his seat in the presidential box, the audience applauded, unaware that history was holding its breath. He sat beside Mary, quietly enjoying the performance, unaware that just down the hall Booth was preparing to change the world. With a single act of violence, when the shot rang out moments later, chaos erupted inside the theater. Mary screamed, soldiers rushed forward, and the audience plunged into panic as the assassin leapt from the box and fled into the night. Lincoln, struck by the bullet, slumped back in his chair, unconscious, his breathing shallow. He was carried across the street to a boarding house where doctors gathered helplessly around him. Knowing there was little they could do, cabinet members, soldiers, and friends filled the room, watching as the life of the man who had held the nation together slipped quietly away. In the early hours of April 15, as Lincoln drew his final breath, the war-weary nation seemed to stand still. Bells that had rung in victory days earlier now tolled in mourning. People poured into the streets in stunned silence, weeping openly for a president whose leadership had guided them through their darkest trial. Even in the South, where bitterness remained deep, many recognized that the man who had just died was someone who had sought peace instead of punishment. The assassination stunned the world, not only because it ended the life of a leader, but because it extinguished the guiding light of a nation attempting to heal. Lincoln had carried the burdens of freedom, unity, and justice farther than any man before him, and the emptiness left by his death seemed to echo across every corner of the country. In the days that followed, his body began a long funeral journey by train, passing through towns and cities where thousands gathered to pay their respects. Old soldiers saluted in silence, mothers clutched children to their chests, and former slaves stood weeping along the tracks, watching the man who had helped secure their future pass by one final time. Newspapers around the world mourned not just a president, but a man who had transformed the meaning of leadership through humility, conviction, and moral clarity. His death became a symbol of sacrifice, a reminder that greatness is rarely achieved without suffering, and that the struggle to uphold human dignity often comes at a terrible cost. Though he did not live to see the full fruits of his work, Lincoln's legacy took root in the foundation of the nation he died protecting. The amendments that abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and promised equal protection under the law carried forward the ideals he had fought for. His vision for a united America, though battered by conflict and scarred by division, survived the years of turmoil and continued to guide generations through new challenges. His life became a testament to what is possible when determination, compassion, and moral courage converge in the face of overwhelming adversity. And so, Abraham Lincoln's dark journey to greatness, marked by failure, hardship, war, and personal tragedy, ended not with defeat, but with a legacy powerful enough to outlive hatred, violence, and even death. He rose from poverty to the presidency, from obscurity to immortality, not because he sought glory, but because he believed that the soul of a nation depended on the principles he dedicated his life to. His story, woven through decades of struggle and sacrifice, remains one of the most profound examples of resilience in human history. And though the bullet that took his life ended his earthly work, the ideals he embodied continued to illuminate the American experience, reminding every generation that true greatness is born not in comfort, but in struggle shaped by the willingness to stand firm when the darkness is deepest, and to believe, against all odds, that a more just world is always within reach. Though his life was taken by violence, his legacy rose beyond the reach of bullet or time, reminding the world that true greatness is carved through struggle, and that light is brightest when born from darkness. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful histories like this.